So we have a couple of ground rules that we were going to put down today, which is that we are going to spend a total of 5 minutes giving our opinion of the whole thing that we've nicknamed Porngate 09. And then after that, we want to drop it. Basically, we're going to talk about it, and we want to move on. Let Matt rest, and we're just going to say our piece and be done. Secondly, this is not a discussion about whether having more women in the community is a problem, like the fact that we don't have more women in the community is a problem. We believe that it is, and we're not going to have that discussion. We're going to have a discussion about the solutions. So if anyone wants to have that discussion, then we need to do that in the hallways or at the bar or somewhere. Okay, so, and the last thing is that we were thinking that the group was going to be much bigger than this, so we created a Google Moderator group for questions. We're going to show a slide that has the URL for that. So if you have questions or you want to vote up questions, you can go there. But hopefully at the end we'll have some time to go over those questions, and maybe even since it's a small group, we can just take questions from the audience. Okay, so I'm Desi. My name is Desi McAdam, and I work for Hashrocket. And I've been in the industry for about 9 years. 5 of those I've been doing development, and 3 of those 5 I've been using Rails every day. So that's background on me. And over on the far right, we have Sarah.
My name is Sarah May, and I've been doing development for about 10 years. And I've done a little bit of everything, but I've been doing Rails since 2006, pretty much exclusively. And here's Lori.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Lori Olson. I've been a software developer for 23 years.
Can't hear.
I've been a software developer for 23 years. I've worked for large and small companies, and I've gone all the way from Fortran and C programming through C++, Java, and for the last 3.5 years, Ruby and Ruby on Rails.
Okay, so that's a little bit about us. So for those of you who read the abstract, one of the things that we wanted to talk about was, so we were going to talk about our experiences, but in the same time, how do we get more women into the community? So what we figured we'd do is we'd just kind of talk back and forth about how we see doing that as suggestions, and hopefully we can get some opinions from the audience at the end. So Sarah, you want to start, or this is basically how do we get more women here? What are some of the things that we're doing to try and solve that problem?
So for me personally, what I have been trying to do is start small, because this is one of these problems that is essentially infinitely recursive, right? You're like, okay, so why aren't there any women coming to the SF Ruby meetups? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's because there aren't enough women in Ruby in general. Well, why aren't there enough women in Ruby in general? Well, maybe it's because there aren't enough women in computer science, and it just keeps going up and up and up, and you get, you come to the point where you just throw up your hands. You're like, these problems are too big. I can't address them. So what I'm working on is I'm trying to get more women to come to the San Francisco Ruby meetups, and it's a small goal, but I think it's achievable. And to that end, I'm going to be doing some workshops in San Francisco for women who want to learn Ruby and Rails, and I'm reaching out to a fairly non-traditional audience. I'm reaching out to women who maybe have never programmed before, people who are web designers, people who might be programmers in other languages. And we're doing the first one in mid-June, and I guess we're just going to kind of see who turns up, whether it's useful. And the plan is to continue doing these monthly and kind of see in a year where we are. And another part of that is that I'm going to be releasing the slide set and the talking points and everything else that comes out of this so that people can pick that up and use it wherever they live if they want to do something similar. And that's part of the Rails Bridge project, the last part. The other thing that I've been working on, and this is probably more difficult actually for me personally, is being more visible in the community, right? I've spent 10 years essentially anonymous within all of the technical communities that I've been in on purpose. And is a difficult thing for me to say, okay, I'm 10 years behind the times, I really need to have a blog, right? And I set that up 4 days before the San Francisco Golden Gate Ruby conference. So, yeah, that's been interesting. And I think that being visible is not something that women do easily in many cases within a community like this. And a lot of that has to do with safety. A lot of that has to do with, having personal information out there on the internet that's available for whatever crazy old boyfriend to find, right? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we don't have a lot of, sometimes anyway, women don't have a lot of time, extra time outside of work to do this kind of stuff, to do the stuff that's really important in order to be a part of the community, like go to user groups and have a blog and go to conferences. So those are the things that I'm working on.
Hey, Sarah, I want to ask, you said that you specifically haven't had a blog.
Right.
Like you said, on purpose. So
right.
What are some of the reasons that you haven't? And I'm curious, Lori, if you've also purposely stayed not visible, or if you've been really visible. I know you started the user group in Calgary, so.
Is this mic working now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nope.
I started the Calgary Ruby user group, and that was primarily because the company I worked for started doing Ruby on Rails development, and we thought about wanting to hire more people and looked around at the community, and there was nothing. There was no visible Ruby developers that we could find. So we poked around a little and started advertising on other user groups that we were a part of, like the local .NET user group and the local Java user group, and said, hey, we're starting this group. Come on out. I think right now, according to our mailing list, the group consists of about 120 people. So that's fairly significant. It's unfortunate that only about 10 of them ever show up at meetings, but it's a different 10 almost every month, though, so that's a good thing. I haven't really kept a low profile, but I also haven't done much of anything about promoting myself. And I think, again, as a woman in the development area, and I've been developing for a lot of years, I think one of the things that I need to do, even though I don't really want to do it, is more self-promotion to increase my visibility so that some of the younger women see women in the development community and know that it is a viable career and that women do enjoy it as a career. Because I really enjoy being a developer, and I've resisted all attempts by any company I've ever worked for, large or small, to be moved into management or anything like that, because I love developing.
Right, but so a couple of points I wanted to hit on was, one is that part of the reason that I started DevChix was because whenever I went to RubyConf in 2005, I was one of 5 women. And I figured the least I could do was know them all. So I looked out at the community, and I was trying to find women role models, people that I could look up to, and I could say, hey, I'm feeling this whenever I'm whenever I'm at work. I'm pair programming with guys, and these are experiences I'm having. And there was really no one for me to reach out to. There were women in IT, and there were women, quality assurance, and there was business analysts, and there were groups for this and groups for that, but there was nothing specific to development. So that was part of why I started DevChix, and I think that's one of the things that we can do to increase women in our community is to reach out to them and have these organizations where the women can, join together to do projects such as the workshops. Because I would love to help out with that. If I lived in San Francisco, I would come and teach, or I would man the nursery. I mean, you guys are going to have a nursery, right? So
yes, we will have childcare.
It's important. I mean, a lot of women can't come out because they can't have 5 hours of time away from their child or children.
Right. I think that's one of my soapboxes, which is that there's a lot of women who drop out for a couple of years when they have kids. And we lose a lot of women, if you think of it kind of like as a pipeline, right? You have women coming in who do their CS degrees or do whatever else degrees, and they go into development for a few years, and then they drop out. And they come back, and they try and get a job, and they're like, they can't even get interviews because there's this gap in their resume. And that's a problem for everyone, right? That's a problem for men, too. But in many professions where there are a lot of women, it's actually pretty easy to be like, yeah, I was raising my kids and now I'm back, and they'll hire you again. And that's not the case in software development. And so one of the groups that I'm reaching out to for this workshop is women who have development skills that are 5 or 6 years out of date, who basically need something to erase that gap. Because when I was coming back after my daughter was born, I was, by pure blind luck, managed to meet someone who had a ticket to RailsConf 2006 and needed some Java work done and wanted to trade. And I said, okay, I can do that. And I showed up at RailsConf 2006 with like 48 hours of Ruby experience. And since then, nobody even mentions the gap. Nobody even sees it. And so I think that there's an avenue back through Ruby and through Rails that doesn't exist in other technologies.
So maybe how do we increase the happen chance? Like, how do we increase the luck for the women who are in the other industries?
I think visibility is a part of that. I think that, having people out there that you can look at and say, you know what, she did that, I can do that too. She took 3 years off or 4 years off or whatever it was to have kids and come back and hey, look, it's not such an abnormal thing anymore. And that helps with, that helps everybody. That helps the people who are doing the hiring. It helps the people who are being hired because, having kids is a part of life, whether or not you have any yourself. And it's just one of these things that I think in such male-dominated industries, it's not something they think about very much.
Another point, one of the significant things about the Rails community is that the percentage of women seems to be much less than the percentage of women in other development communities, like the Java world and the .NET world. And we did have a little bit of pre-discussion about this, and in my experience, because I've worked in both very large and very small companies, it seems to be that there are a much greater percentage of women developers in the larger companies and not in the smaller companies. And, there's lots of reasons for that. Significant ones include things like maternity leave, so that you can go off and have a child and know that there's a job there for you when you get back.
And training.
Training as well. That's a big one. A lot of women, when you're taking care of the kids, everything else, you don't have time to spend all those evening hours and weekend hours maybe learning some new technology on your own. Having corporate-sponsored training is great because you can get training in the new stuff without having to sacrifice huge amounts of family time that you just can't sacrifice.
Do you want some stats for that? I actually looked this up really previous weekend. For open source communities in general, it's about 2 to 3% involvement for women. They checked that in 2006 at one of the US cons, and about 20 to 25% in corporate environments.
You want to repeat that?
I'm just going to repeat what was just spoken in the front here. With some real stats from about 2006, was that there were participation in the open source community was at about 2-3% for women, and more like 20 to 25% in
Use the word,
Yeah.
the dirty word, enterprise.
Yeah, and the dirty word enterprise. Although I did notice in the keynote this morning that maybe it was just an impression that I got, but did we get suddenly more open to enterprise just because more time has passed, so it's making more inroads?
I think I must have missed that part. So going back to the visibility thing, so I just want to say that this is something I find very difficult myself. I was expecting a much larger crowd, so I was extremely nervous. But it's still nerve-wracking to be up here and trying to have this conversation because it's a difficult conversation and it's also difficult to be up here. I don't know if there's much we can do to help women get over this fear, because I have the only thing that's helped me is that on the DevChix list we have a few women that are constantly pushing me. They're constantly emailing me individually going, are you speaking at RailsConf? Are you speaking at OpenBridge? Are you speaking at and if I say no and no and no and no, eventually I start feeling pretty guilty about this. So I've been making an effort to try and speak at more conferences. And I don't know if maybe as a community we can try to encourage that too. Wasn't it you that was telling me that part of the reason that Audrey had such success with hers is that they reached out on a personal level. They went to each and every person that was going to, well, not every, you tell, you have a better.
Yeah, there's Audrey Eschreit, who's a Rails and Ruby developer in Portland, who's not here sadly, was saying that in Portland they actually have a pretty good gender balance by open source community standards at a lot of their events. And the reason is because the organizers of the events actually ask women to show up. Sounds like it should be pretty simple, but I'll draw the distinction between sending out a mass email and sending an email to one person in particular and asking them to come. And that helped them get over essentially the chicken and the egg problem where, women don't feel comfortable because there aren't any women, so how do we get any women to show up? Because then if you have a couple that show up, the one that showed up randomly without, that you didn't know about, feels more comfortable, more like this is someplace that they can hang out, and they'll come back. And they've had a lot of success with that tactic, which is seemingly simple, I guess, but it hadn't occurred to me before.
So one other thing to bring up is that people always, bring up the pipeline problem. The pipeline problem. The fact that they say, oh, well, how do we get people into the community if there's no people to be gotten? And I mean, we have suggestions for how to start working on that.
Well, people talk about it as a pipeline, as if there's like kids going in one end and like retirees coming out the other. But it's really actually a lot more complicated than that, right? People enter the field through many different avenues, and especially, I think, in Rails, where, I think the percentage of CS degrees in the Rails community is probably lower than perhaps in other communities. And so there are a lot of different ways that people get into Rails. And if you think about women who are programmers, and, there's various ways that you can try to affect that pipeline or that flow, right? You can try and get more kids in the beginning, right? So you can work on workshops for kids, teaching kids how to program, and there's a lot of interesting developments happening on that right now as part of the Ruby Bridge project. They're working on developing some curriculum for kids, and I've been volunteering. There's a lot of programs you can volunteer at that, I spend a couple of days each summer teaching JavaScript to high school girls who love it. And, there's a lot of different things that you can do to try and encourage people who haven't made their decision yet about what they're going to do to consider programming as an option. And there are other ways, as you go along the pipeline, right? There's mentoring programs in CS programs. And here's another one of my soapboxes that we've happened upon. CS programs in the 90s set up these barriers to entry on purpose, right? Because they had way more applicants than they had spots because of the .com boom. And what that meant was that the first couple of classes you took were really hard, and they were designed to get people to drop out. And while that seemed like a viable thing to do, what that meant in actuality was that all of the women dropped out because the guys generally had been programming since they were in high school. And if you came
or
to...
longer.
Or earlier, right. And if you came to a CS program and you hadn't done programming before, you'd be lost in the first two classes. And a lot of CS departments really haven't adjusted that formula enough yet. Now that the boom is over and they don't really need to weed people out anymore, now it's just institutional inertia. And if any of you have ever worked in academia, there's a lot of inertia.
Hey, actually, Lori, you've been around for 23 years, you said. So what's the difference between the pipeline now and the pipeline when you first started?
Well,
Were there more women?
Oh, yeah.
When you started?
Oh, definitely.
I came in whenever the pipeline was already empty, so...
Yeah. I entered, well, when I started university, I was part of a large bump in the enrollment of computer science students. At my particular university, there were, I believe, close to 800 people taking the first year computer science course. And then it scared them, and exactly what you talked about happened. The second year course became the weeder course, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't get that many people going through because they couldn't handle it at the higher levels. And they succeeded. I think at the end of the 4 years, 800 at the beginning, I think there were 56 graduates total at the end of the 4 years, and I'm positive it was more like 30% women at that point. That was, okay, I'll date myself, that was 86. I don't think there's anything close to that percentage of women graduating from computer science classes today.
There's not even anything close to that in enrollment in the first place.
And so there's an interesting article that I read a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times in which they said that which they essentially validated your experience, which they said in the 80s, it was 25 to 30% women on average in most computer science departments. And they didn't have data on why it had gone down, but they did note that it directly corresponded to the rise of macho gaming culture.
The rise of what?
Macho gaming culture, which
macho gaming culture?
Gaming, right?
Oh, okay.
Which associated computer science with first-person shooter games, essentially, and that culture. So that's another, I think, issue that is one of those that's like, I have no idea how to address it, but it seems to be an issue.
There's also issues around perception of the educators. I know that as a student, I was very interested always in the sciences. And this is, goes back to my high school days. And I was trying to pick among, like a half a dozen different science-related professions that I perhaps wanted to get into. And my guidance counselor directed me away from professions that had an image of being male-dominated and, just too rough. An example being geophysics. That was an area that my guidance counselor was just horrified that I was even considering.
Was your guidance counselor a woman or a man?
It was a man.
Okay.
A man who retired the year after. He was like 65.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience to that. Not quite. The way I got in computer science was very much luck as well. The unfortunate thing is that I didn't really know much at all whenever I went to school or whenever I started at school. So I thank them for giving me a basic education, but in the end, I'm kind of pissed off that I got a degree because you don't really need it. And that's another thing that I think there's a lot higher proportion of men, at least in this community, not just men, but people in general in this community who don't necessarily have degrees. At some point, they realize that they could learn something and do it on their own and make a living. So there's a lot of really young guys in this community, and that's cool. But I think that we need to educate young women that they also have this opportunity. That's something that I know most high school teenage girls don't know.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Although, I find it very encouraging that these days every teenage girl that I know can make their own MySpace page and, do all this HTML, and they don't think of it as programming, but they're at least, familiar enough that they can wrangle a little bit of text markup.
Yeah, they're getting basics.
It's probably a point to consider. I see in the Rails community that there's an awful lot of people women migrating out of the developer role and more into the designer role and maybe testing. I think we need to find a way to reverse that trend. I'd like to start there's a lot more women testers. Personally, I know a lot more women testers than developers these days. And a lot of the designers I know are also women. There is not nearly the gender unbalance in that area. Or
it's the opposite balance.
Yeah. I'd like to try and pull some of those people into the development community because I think they'd be really valuable.
I agree with that. There's a lot of discussions that can happen around why that happens as well, right? I don't even want to go into that, but so we've been talking mostly about things we can do to get more women here and supporting the guys out there. The things you can do is help us with workshops, help us reach out and teach people, help us when you find a woman programmer who's a .NET developer or a Java developer, tell her about Rails, tell her that it's not all guys. Give me just a sec. And, just ask us what you can do. When you see us in the hallway, ask us, are you working on any workshops? Do you need someone to come and help you teach? Do you need someone to babysit for you? You guys can watch kids just as good as us. You don't think so, but you can. So that's my little push on that. Shall we take a question? There's a guy back there. Sure. All right. I think we will take questions because it's a small group, and I'm tired of hearing just us. So.
Should women be given either discounts or free tickets to RailsConf?
The question is, should women be given discounts or free tickets to RailsConf? I have an opinion on this. My opinion is that in situations where women can't come or can't afford to pay for it or something like that, organizations like mine should be a place for them to go and ask for help. And if but they need to know that they can do that. And what I can do is reach out to the Rails community and say, hey, I've got 5 women who can't afford to pay, but they really want to go. Can you guys help us out? And just ask the community for help. I mean, I've asked RailsConf for help before, and they have helped. But it's our responsibility too to ask. We have to ask, or else how does anyone know that we need the help?
And it would help if there was childcare available.
Noted, guys? Okay.
So my degree's in linguistics, and one of the things that I always noticed was that even in the computational linguistics classes that I took, the gender balance was about 50-50. So coming to the Rails community was sort of a shock to me. And my question is really, why aren't we making a bigger effort to draw people from not just the CS pool or people who have entered into the dev community of their own volition, but into designers and people who clearly have the analytical capability, people who are in business or whatever that you think would be better represented but aren't thus far. We've got lots of people who have non-CS degrees, and the discussion seems to be really focused on the CS pipeline.
You know what? I I personally do reach out. I don't know, every time... Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, why are we only looking at the CS type of industry to pull people into the Rails community? Why aren't we looking into other areas, people we know are intelligent and have the analytical skills necessary to do development? I do. I met 2 women in the speaker room yesterday who were here not because they're developers, but because they're here as supporting staff for one of the companies. And once I found that out, I was like, damn. And then I went, you want to learn? And they were like, actually, I kind of thought about it. I'm like, okay, email me. And, we have a lot of women on the list that have come to the list exactly like that. So I do, and I just think it's something that we all need to be aware of. Like, you just ask. Because every once in a while you come across that person that says, yeah, at some point I actually kind of thought about doing that, but I didn't really think it was the right field for me because of blah, 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 blah. And you just invite them back.
And I was discussing this with someone from Pivotal, I think, at LookSmart yesterday. Basically, there's a naming problem that's happening here. And the issue is that there are a lot of people, women who are web designers and web developers, and they do, maybe they go all the way back to JavaScript, and that's about it. They don't think of themselves as developers. They think of themselves as designers. And what's happening in many cases is that a guy will read a book on a subject or like 3 blog posts, and then suddenly he's a developer, call himself a developer, right? And what that really means is, I want to be a developer, I'm working on being a developer, and I'm going to say it, and that helps me become it, right? And that's very valid. And women, in my experience, don't really do that, right? They'll be doing this incredible like Flash logic and all this stuff, and they still don't think of themselves as developers. But calling yourself a developer, I think, is an important thing to do, because there's a marked salary differential between people who call themselves developers and people who don't. And so there's this issue of, we need to be more public, I think, about our definition of, are you a developer? Yes, you are a developer. Please come into our community. Because there are these people that are out there, and they just, maybe don't realize that what they're doing is actually development.
You have anything you want to add to that? I thought I saw a hand. Go ahead.
I just kind of want to address what you just said there, because that's that sentiment that I actually started hearing back from my wife recently about software development. She's in an authoritative position now, and she was very intimidated to start that, because a lot of the people she's dealing with are men that are maybe 15 years her senior. But she's discovering that many times that they don't know as much as they present that they know. And I think that's a problem often with women, as you mentioned, is that there is this notion that if I present myself this way, I'm going to get called on it. There's always this, there's always going to be a core segment that's going to ask me to prove myself, be put on the spot and that. So how do you deal with that?
Poorly.
So
the question was around essentially, women won't present themselves as something that they're not because they're intimidated by the fact that they might be called on it, where a man will.
It's called Imposter Syndrome.
She has words.
And women suffer from it probably more than guys, but I've known guys that suffer from it as well. In fact, I believe my husband was just blog posting about it a couple of weeks ago. The notion that you perhaps don't know as much as you think you do, or that your skills aren't worth as much as you're being paid.
Well, yeah, DHH, or David, sorry, not DHH, David. David brought that up this morning about how, we all think that the guy next to us or the girl next to us is a better coder than us. And really, everybody's kind of in the same boat. Everybody's learning, and it's something we all have to remember, but I know that it's something that's really difficult for me.
Well, I absolutely loved David's comment this morning when he said, no, I don't know that. I no longer know everything there is to know in Rails, because that's a really important thing that developers in general, but especially the women, need to be comfortable saying, no, I don't know that right now. But if it becomes important to me, I'll figure it out.
And the issue, I think, for me is that I often feel like people make judgments about my gender based on my response. So if I say I don't know something, then I'm afraid they're going to come away with this, because women are so unusual and I may be the only woman they know that does this stuff, they'll come away with a poor impression of women in development in general.
Well, we're representing our entire gender. I mean,
right, and that's.
I mean, that was one of my biggest fears about being up here today. Is that holy crap? I hope I don't say anything that's gonna like screw my whole gender. I don't know. It's.
Yeah, and I actually thought about it. I'm like, what do I really know about women in development? I mean, I have my story, and that's about it.
And that's something that's intimidating, right? I mean, people need to get up here, but at the same time, I'm almost wanting all the women who are in this audience right now to be standing up here and answering questions, and because you guys are only getting my side of it or our side of it, and that's intimidating. We're getting low on time, so I think we should maybe move into the things we can do to keep women here once they're here, and this might be a good place for our 5-minute time box on the whole Porngate thing. Hang on a sec.
So I think I'm going to take the lead on this one because I was, I think, the only one of the three of us who was actually there I'm sure you guys don't need a recap. But the first thing I want to say is I don't think Matt is a bad guy. I don't think he's misogynist. I think he made a mistake that a lot of people make in software development. And that is, you walk into a room full of 99 guys and one woman, and your brain says, okay, that person doesn't match my pattern for software developer, therefore they must not be a software developer. And so you tend to ignore the outliers, right? And that's a difficult thing to overcome, even for me. I was talking to another woman last night, and she said, yeah, I do the same thing. I see another woman at a technical presentation, and I assume that she's a recruiter, and I assume that she's in sales. And then I have to stop and think and tell myself, no, okay, I have to assume she's a developer until I go up to talk to her and actually figure out that she's a recruiter, right? And so this is a difficult problem for everyone. I think that ultimately the solution to this, right, is to change the correct match pattern, right? To bring more women into development so it's not such a weird thing. So that when you look at a room full of developers, you don't see 99% A and 1% B and just, kind of disregard the B. So long term, that's my take on what we need to do in order to fix this kind of thing from happening. And I would also like to say that I don't think that the organizers of the conference did anything wrong, because I voted for the talk, and I probably, if this hadn't happened, I would vote for something like that again, because I trust the judgment of the people in the Ruby and Rails community to draw the line at the right place. And I've had a couple people come up to me actually in the last couple of days and be like, can you look at my slides and make sure that they're not offensive? And I'm like, no, because I trust you. You're not going to cross that line. I think that a lot of the negative backlash that happened with this incident was related to this feeling of, now everything's going to be censored, everything's going to be boring, everyone's going to, draw the line too far in the other direction. But I don't want to see that happen, honestly, because I think that, especially, not to get all, after school special, but I think we learned something about this, right? You learned something from this. We have a clearer picture of where that line is. And as a relatively young technical community, I think that it was bound to happen eventually. And I give a lot of credit to the organizers of the Golden Gate Ruby Conference, who really made a huge effort to reach out to women to come to the conference. I mean, I've got a 5-month-old son. They found me a place to express breast milk. I mean, come on, how many people do that, ask for that when you go to a technical conference? But they found it on very short notice, and they reached out to Jackie Marr to come and give this talk on her work with the project in Malawi. And so I think that part of the reason this happened is because there were a larger, perhaps, percentage of women there than are actually in the Ruby community, which meant that it wasn't just one person saying this who could kind of be dismissed as a, outlier, or crazy, or whatever. There were enough people talking about it that it actually gained some traction. So I think my 5 minutes are up.
Go ahead, Laura, I'll let you.
Okay, so I wasn't there, and my take on this is not from the presentation itself, but from the community reaction to this event. And really, I think it got blown out of proportion for the same reason that I run into conflicts between other developers in my own company frequently. You can't argue with someone about how they feel, okay? You can't. People feel the way they feel. You can have a discussion with them and try and understand why they feel that way, and you can have a discussion with them about what your intentions were. But arguing with someone about how they feel and telling them that they shouldn't feel that way is never going to be a win for anyone. And I think that's where the whole community reaction just devolved. So that was my sort of take on it.
Okay, so I've been trying to figure out what I wanted to say whenever I got to this point. So I'm just going to let it go, and whatever comes, comes. But basically, I think that I don't actually know what Matt looks like, so I don't know. Hi, Matt. I think that if Matt had just said, "Oh crap, I offended you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you," things would have moved on, and it would have been fine. It's a different thing to say, "I'm sorry you were offended." So that's my one point about that, and I think that the whole thing would have gone over much faster if that had just been the reaction and been done with it. And secondly, I don't know if David's in here. Hi, David. I'm gonna say just this one thing. Next time, do us a favor and just keep your mouth shut. It didn't help. And that's it. We'd like to be done with it now. And we'd like everyone else to be done with it. And we'd like to let Matt go on with his life. And we would like to go on with ours. We've had so many conversations about this stuff that we're kind of sick of it now, too. So
yeah, there's like 24 women in tech lists out there, and every single freaking one of them is talking about it, and it's... Yeah.
We're sick of it.
Yeah, so it seems like something that has captured the wider audience, for better or for worse.
So we're pretty close to the end of our time, but if anyone wants to maybe have a few questions or whatever, we can take a few.
There's Mike.
Thank you. It's more of just a comment. Whoa. This is more of just a comment. I've hired high-performance teams for about 20 years. I've hired high-performance teams, operations team for about 20 years, and have really focused on equity. And so some of the rock star sysadmins, et cetera, have been women. So keep on keeping on. I'm actually with a really hot startup in San Francisco looking for really good Ruby developers. So if any women are out there in the San Francisco area, come see me.
If you email me directly at DevChix with that information, I can then pass it on to the list.
And I think just to piggyback off that a little bit, if you want to have women on your team, you need to actually try really hard. And I know it's kind of a bummer, but if you even want to interview women, and this comes back to that issue of, I don't want to overstate my qualifications. It makes it really hard to write a resume when you feel that way. And it makes it really hard to apply for jobs. You look at this job and it's got this, all these bullet points of things that they want. And you're like, God, I've got they want 6 years of this, 4 years of that. And you're like, well, I've only done it for 2 years. And so you don't apply. And I think that a lot of guys approach looking for jobs differently, right? They look at it and they're like, I read a blog post about that. I can do that. I'm sending them my resume, right? Because companies really they're just looking for smart people, right? They don't really want most of them, right? The good ones. They don't really want the bullet points. They just want someone who's really sharp and can pick it up. But the way that a lot of them go about actually trying to get resumes in the door is I think, sort of antithetical to that purpose.
Well, just one note on that. There was some study I read somewhere that if you asked for 2 years experience and a guy came along and saw you wanted 2 years experience and he had a year experience, he would apply for the job. But if a woman had, 10 months experience, she wouldn't. Or if she had, close to 2 years but not quite 2 years, she wouldn't.
So we have a question back here now.
Actually, it's a little more of a comment. It seems like there's a sort of a missing piece of technology here that would be perhaps a website, a community that would allow women to advertise services not based on what they name themselves, but what they can do, and sort of let the site decide what it is. So you say, do you do CSS? Yes. Do you do JavaScript? Yes. And they put the developer label next to it that maybe protects anonymity in the way Craigslist does, so you can email people directly without necessarily divulging your email address. I know after Kathy Sierra, there's a big pullback, I think, of female bloggers. And also, it seems like it seems like motherhood comes up over and over again. And it means you have less time to do things during the day, which means that perhaps you might not get that gig that, the $500 website because you can't do it in 2 weeks, whereas someone next to you could. But I could certainly see some sort of a community where there's a little bit more collaboration, where you advertise your services, there's a little bit of anonymity, and then when people sign up, I know I have a partner and a 2-year-old daughter, and she doesn't have a lot of time, but she loves the Etsy sites, and there's this huge sort of mom blogging and craft community. It seems like instead of doing crafts and blogging about bike rides, they could just be writing snippets of websites and collaborating on GitHub. And it seems like there's something we can do in technology to make that easier.
So just that was a lot for me to try and address, but so. DevChix, I know, we specifically have goals around trying to get communities set up where that sort of thing is the case. But there's issues, right? We don't have time. Those of us who have, the desire to do it are working full-time jobs and don't necessarily have the ability to do it all ourselves. So we could use help from the community. I mean, help us design help us figure out what we need. Help us figure out the requirements for the, the story cards for the site, and help us build it.
And not only that, but guys, really, if you think that women who aren't developers who could be developers, be supportive. Give them a poke. Show them stuff. Get them excited about it.
Because I think
that would be way more useful than all of us standing up here and being visible. Having someone that you know and trust tell you that you can do something is really valuable.
Yeah, I'm just as a side note to that, I'm very lucky because all the guys that I work with are very supportive, and I appreciate it, guys. Thanks.
And I think we're pretty close to out of time.
I think we might be over. We can keep going? Okay.
Great.
Well, I'm actually really happy that you guys just said that, because it's a perfect lead into my question, because it's actually a really common situation trying to poke a female female potential, like be it a sister or a girlfriend or a daughter or a mother or just a friend. And you frequently run into just this sort of resistance, like I don't know computers, I don't know tech, like I'm not good at math, like all these sort of very common responses that I just see just anecdotally all over the place. So that's like my most common, that's the best way that I've seen like all the institutional stuff that you talked about. So like what can I do in that situation? Like what's the best approach to actually try to get a person past those walls?
Well, it depends on the situation, obviously, and the age of the person that you're trying to get them involved, or the age of the person you're trying to get involved. I know that I probably would have gotten involved much younger if someone had just talked to me about it. And a lot of times whenever I get I'm not good at math, I just usually go back with, why don't you come sit down and see what I do? Just compare with me for a minute, and I'll show you what I do, and you'll see that I don't do math every day. Yeah.
Mathphobics Anonymous.
We have another question back here, then I'll bring it up front.
This is not actually a question. This is some statistics I want to share with you. And it's kind of amusing to me. I come from India, which is supposedly a developing country and ought to be having more gender discrimination. But what I'm seeing here is quite opposite of that. I run a company called Winsol. And we have like 16 developers, and 6 out of those are women. And they are proud Rails developers, been working on since version 0.6. One of our first open source contributions to Rails was written by Ritu, who's a woman, and she wrote a paper on gem before Active Merchant was out around the same time. So it's kind of amusing, but I thought it would be the reverse, but just an observation.
There are some cultural issues involved. I think that's a great data point, in that there are, in a lot of other countries, don't necessarily have this problem so much. I don't really have the answers for why that is exactly. I'm sure it's a very complex problem. But it's something to be aware of, I think. It's something to be cognizant of, certainly.
Another comment back here.
On this note, I noticed that when I was working in enterprise and not on Rails or open source, that there were a lot more women, but the majority of them were South or East Asian. And I wonder if there's any correlation between open source having a lack of minorities and also a lack of women. And I wanted to make a comment, too, that I totally agree with you guys when you said that a lot of us don't want to talk about this kind of stuff. It's so much easier to just hide under a rock and, I'd rather talk to you about snowboarding or music. But I think at this point, it would be really good for all of the women to come out and just start blogging. And if any guys want to write comments on their blog, that would be extremely supportive.
Yeah, I think so part of the problem with being a woman in development who has a blog is that you're one, there aren't very many of us, right? And that's part of the reason why I avoided having one for so long, because you do attract a lot of trolls. And you should see some of the comments that I deleted off of the posts that I made. This is not stuff that I would ever want my daughter to experience or see. And a lot of it, essentially amounts to personal threats. And for a long time, that kept me away, because I had a couple of experiences like that on mailing lists and so forth. And I finally decided that, it's these guys. Okay, so logically, I know that they're all blowhards, right? They're morons, and they're using the anonymity of the internet to try and, to essentially take out on me whatever frustrations they might have. But emotionally, and I've been trying to separate that, from the emotional reaction of, holy shit, this guy is threatening my daughter and my family, and he knows where I work, and so part of the issue, I think, is that there need to be more women out there blogging, and that's why I'm still doing it, right? And it's not because I have this passion to write, which or I have tons of extra time and I need something to do with it. It's because I'm trying to make it
better,
safer by being, by having, maybe if there's more targets, we'll have fewer attacks per target, right?
You guys laugh, but one of the things that I've noticed about DevChix is that we get a few of the pretty nasty troll type things, but for the most part, people don't attack a group of women. I guess it doesn't happen as much. So one of the reasons for the blog is so that the women in our organization can get their voices out and be able to point to that when they're going to a job interview and say, hey, look, I do blog about Ruby. I've been blogging about it for 2 years. Just look at the author tag for me on DevChix and you'll have it. And it's a little bit empowering to be able to blog within a group of people, because you're not quite so out there by yourself.
Another comment here.
Hey, I want to throw in a few comments for you. First of all is that I think we could take 90% of this conversation and replace women with people of color. People over the age of 35, you know. And so obviously not being representative of any of those groups, I kind of feel like an outsider in the discussion. But, you know, as a community, what we're really talking about is how to grow the community, right, and how to grow the diversity in the community. And I think this group, different from many others, has really benefited from communal diversity, that a lot of the people who are responsible for building the tools, the technology, came from diverse backgrounds. You know, you were talking about people not majoring in computer science. So there were some computer science people, there were some literature people, some art history people, and that mix was different and created a community that was different. Therefore, people like me, young, white, and male, we have a lot to gain from investing new people into the community, because that's where the revolutionary ideas are really going to come from, in interacting with them. You know, David talked this morning about people not knowing about their requirements, and that discussion of talking to people with different perspectives brings out the next great ideas.
You know, actually, I just want to make two comments on that. One is that we personally, all three of us, acknowledge the fact that we have a fail, which is that we're all white. And we want to fix that too, but since we're not in that minority community, Black, Asian, Spanish, whatever it may be, we don't have a way of getting into that community. So we want those people to reach out to us and tell us what we can do to help there as well. So that's point one. And point two is that I actually made the statement, if we want Rails to be more inclusive, then we don't do X, Y, and Z. And just, it was in passing, talking to a friend, and the response was, we don't want Rails to be, you know, we don't want a lowest common denominator. And that was a little bit eye-opening for me to be like, what does that mean exactly? We don't want to, you know, we don't want to grow, we don't want to be inclusive. Do we think that if we're being inclusive that we're letting people in who shouldn't be here? I mean, I don't know. So I would be interested in any sort of feedback that you guys or the community at large could give me on that.
And we just have time for one last comment or question or whatever this is.
I think I have three comments. One is that some of the high priority people in this room, starting with David himself, do not allow comments on their blog. So women that want that have a track record of blogging for purposes of being known to employers and stuff like that, just turn off the comments, you know, if you're worried about trolls. The other one that's kind of been bubbling in my mind throughout this whole thing, and it doesn't get a lot of talk, is that technical schools, as far as I know, have not yet jumped on the Rails bandwagon. And a lot of minorities and people with less opportunities than some of us had here, that's their entrance into the industry. So I'm thinking of my younger sister who graduated high school, didn't go to college. I convinced my father to put her into basically DeVry to study programming. So she studied web programming, and we were able to get her a job doing Java at our startup. There is no pathway like that right now. So I think maybe that's part of the issue with the diversity. And I think as a community we can establish you know, kind of programs to try to spur more Rails instructions. However, just in the third point, I think that is going to run into potentially misguided objections from folks that don't want to dilute the talent pool of the community. And that's one of the issues of the lowest common denominator kind of argument, which is very, very tricky, because I think what we do discriminate against actively, whether we admit it or not, is intellect, and we don't want low intellect people in the community. And I'm saying this is a thin line. I'm not saying that this is a reason to not do that. I'm saying that from talking to folks and just a long career, there is a stigma and a discrimination that comes from not having a CS degree or not being a hacker, and basically being introduced through the trade.
We can grow that, though. I mean, there's companies that are doing Optiva. I don't know if the Optiva guys are here, but they have built an apprenticeship program that I completely admire, and I think that more companies can do that sort of thing. Reach out to high school. Just ask, is anyone here interested in learning how to program? And if they say yes, then bring them into the organization. As long as they're seem to be smart, intelligent people, and they have an interest, then we should grow that.
But I'm saying we need to do it on more than just an individual basis. Like the actual organizations and leaders of this little mini industry of ours, if you want to call it that, should probably be actively reaching out to deans and directors of these training programs and trade schools and high school trade school.
There was someone at the Teaching Rails BOF last night who is a community college teacher who teaches Rails, and I'm trying to remember what his name was, but I'm sure Ben Schofield could probably put you in touch. I hope, maybe. So there is a little bit of that happening, I think, and with regards to the intellect, I think you kind of nailed it in terms of what people are thinking. But the way that I look at it is that there are people with good intellects sort of at every class level of society. And, we need all of the good brains that we can get. And if it brings in a bunch of people that we don't necessarily want to personally work with, they're going to come anyway, essentially.
And we'll weed them out.
Yeah, but it's worth it to have those people if we get, even 1% extra of the people that are brilliant.
It doesn't hurt us if there's more developers. No, right. It's not a zero-sum game.
Right.
Exactly. It's not a zero-sum game, is what he said.
I think we have to cut this off. I do want to say thank you to everyone who came. And, I know I poked at David, but I mean no harm. I love David to death. I don't know Matt, but I'm sure I'll get to know him really soon. And
if any of you would like to continue the discussion, I think we could probably go to lunch and
we'd be glad to. And for the ladies who are in the room who are not part of DevChix, I want to talk to you guys and tell you about DevChix. And also there will be a DevChix dinner, so catch me so I can tell you the details.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.